Okay, so next topic that we are looking at is the macromolecule carbohydrates. The macromolecules carbohydrates. Okay, so the objectives for this lesson will include us knowing the functions of the carbohydrates. So we need to know, what do carbohydrates do? What is the biological significance of carbohydrates? How do they function? And then we need to distinguish among the different types of carbohydrates. And then we need to describe the structure of a sugar. We need to describe the structure of a sugar. And then we need to name the different forms of the carbohydrate molecules. And we need to relate the structure of polysaccharides to their functions. And we need to also compare storage polysaccharides with structural polysaccharides. So these are the objectives that we need to achieve by the end of the lesson. Okay. So in the preamble, we find that when you look at the carbohydrates, the structure of the carbohydrates, they contain a carbon atom, they contain a hydrogen atom, and an oxygen atom. So these are in the ratio that is approximately 1 carbon to 2 hydrogen to 1 oxygen. In other words, they have generally a formula of CH2O with an N, which refers to the number of carbohydrate groups. So it contains these atoms in the ratio of 1 to 2 to 1, 1 to 2 to 1, generally. So the value of N, this N can vary from 3. So the 3 is the smallest sugar that we're going to find. Those that have 3 carbons, they are the least sugars or the smallest sugar that we're going to find. So this term of carbohydrate simply means hydrate of carbon, and it reflects the same ratio of hydrogen to oxygen that we find in water. However, these really are molecules. However, these really are molecules that have a carbonyl group. If we can remember from yesterday's discussion, said that these molecules have a carbonyl group and also several hydroxyl functional groups, along with several to main carbon hydrogen covalent bonds. So the carbohydrates are made of carbon to hydrogen covalent bonds with a carbonyl group and several hydroxyl functional groups. So when you look at the carbonyl group and its and the carbohydrates multiple hydroxyl groups, these provide the sugars with an array of reactive and hydrophilic functional groups. So these are very essential to the reactions that the carbohydrates undergo. And then remember we said that carbohydrates or the carbonyl groups could either be an aldehyde or could be a ketone. So we said that aldehyde have a terminal, or an aldehyde is a terminal carbonyl group. An aldehyde is a terminal carbonyl group. Then we said that a ketone is a non-terminal carbonyl group. So we said that a ketone is found intermediate, it's an intermediate carbonyl group. So how does this act as reducing agents? So we're going to learn more about this as we look at the individual carbohydrates, as we look at the individual carbohydrates. So on the classes of carbohydrates, they are simply generally divided into three main classes. So there are three main classes of carbohydrates. So we have the monosaccharides, we have the disaccharides, and the polysaccharides. So generally, we have these three main classes of carbohydrates. Of course, we can also have the oligosaccharides. These three are the main classes that we have for carbohydrates. And then the names of carbohydrates typically end with a suffix of O, S, E. So they typically end in O, S, E. Most of the names typically. Of course, we have deviations from this general or typical rule. Now let us look at the functions. So what are the functions, some of the functions that carbohydrates do? So the first one, we know carbohydrates are for energy production. So they are energy giving foods. So the first function is energy production. So I've put in brackets immediate energy provision. So when we find that many of the cells use glucose, a monosaccharide glucose, as a source of energy. So when we look at cells such as red blood cells, they're only able to produce cellular energy from glucose. And when we look at the brain cells are actually highly sensitive to low blood glucose, because unless under extreme starvation conditions, we find that the brain uses only glucose for energy production and for it to be able to function. So we find that actual glucose is very important for the maintenance of the integrity of the nervous system and the red blood cells. So remember, we talked about the hydrocarbons before we started talking about the functional groups. We talked about the hydrocarbons, and we talked about hydrocarbons being good sources of fuel or energy. So the energy that comes from glucose comes from the chemical bonds between the carbon atoms. So those are carbon to carbon bonds that are found in carbohydrates. That's where we find the energy that is produced from glucose. So our bodies are able to break down those bonds and capture the energy that is able to facilitate in cellular respiration. So carbohydrates are important for energy production. And then they're also important for energy storage. So for example, if there is excess glucose in the body, there's excess glucose in the body or in plants, we find that this is stored as a glycogen. So that excess glucose is going to be stored as glycogen in animals or as starch in plants. So in animals, the storage form is glycogen. In plants, it is starch. And the majority of the glucose stored as glycogen is primarily in the muscles and the liver of animals. So the other function of carbohydrates is that they are building macromolecules. So they are used in the building of macromolecules. So for example, when you look at the pentose sugars, the ribose and the deoxyribose sugars, you find that they are important for the formation of nucleic acid. So they are components of nucleic acid. So we have a ribose sugar that we find in RNA, and the deoxyribose sugar that we find in DNA. So these are important in the building of macro molecules. Then, in addition to this, we find that if all of the energy, the glycogen storing capacity. Remember I said that one of the functions of carbohydrates is the storage, and we talked of glycogen. So in situations where all of the energy, the glycogen storing capacity and the building needs of the body are met, find that excess glucose will be used to synthesize fats. So no wonder we find that a diet that is high in carbohydrates and calories can add to the fat pounds or amount of fat that someone has. So it's used to build macromolecules such as the nucleic acid, and also carbohydrates can be used to synthesize lipids or fat. Then they are also for structural support. So for example, cellulose. And look at cellulose, which is the most abundant polysaccharides that we find in nature. And also chitin that we mentioned previously, which is found in exoskeletons of many species of creatures such as arthropods. So these are used as a structural element, are used for structural support. So carbohydrates function as a structural element. And then the other function is that carbohydrates function as protein sparing. They have a protein saving actions. Protein saving action. So there are certain situations where there is insufficient glucose to meet the body's need. So what happens in such situation? We find that glucose is able to be synthesized from amino acids. So in extreme conditions of insufficient glucose is able to be synthesized from amino acid. So when you look at the proteins, there's no storage molecule of amino acids. So for this, for the synthesis of glucose from amino acid, it means that there should be a destruction of the proteins. So there's a destruction of proteins, mostly from the muscle tissue. So basically, cells need to have the presence of adequate glucose, which basically spares the breakdown of the proteins from being used to make glucose that is needed by the body.